So the red is not. So it's kind of, these are things we've learned over time that don't work very well, to the green, what we have found to work. So the first one is the primary emphasis on the presenter versus the primary emphasis on the audience. And it's subtle, but I'll give some examples here in the sense of, because most feedback setting and even kind of training ends up being the focus on the presenter. So for instance, even for Scott, who's not here, I hope he's recovering. But it's very easy as when you set up the ritual that you overly think about kind of Scott in that part, as opposed to the primary emphasis being the audience. So I'll give some examples. When you start to do that, one of the things we've learned is the audience, when you don't keep them as the emphasis, things like having them take notes, having them come prepared for the notes, having them remember to take feedback. And we've run this at times where all of a sudden it becomes about the presenter and nobody in the audience is getting any feedback. And not only does that not train the primary feedback giving, it makes it worse, the secondary emphasis on actually helping the receiver. It's worse, and Charlie touched on this and Megan touched on this, if you're not getting, it's only feedback from the senior kind of crowd, it's not as valuable as when you're getting feedback and seeing the patterns. So that's a mistake we've made, where we emphasize the presenters and not emphasize the audience. So that was the first one. The second one is, especially for as senior leaders, when you're setting this up, of not role modeling high standards, and versus kind of the senior experts are sharing publicly. So it's quite deliberate. And in fact, we have run this ritual, and it's caused tremendous challenges on this, to the point sometimes of dysfunction, where it's set up where someone may go and present. So in that case, like a Scott would go and present, and just the crowd gives feedback in the app. And the challenge for that can be, sometimes you can empower people to think their feedback is really good, when in fact it may or may not be. And I wouldn't underestimate the people in the seats as the senior experts have earned that. They've earned it over time with their experience, and experience does matter. And the one element to this is that, again, I'll get into the third one, there is diversity. So it's not one person who's the expert, which you've made that mistake, which is kind of that one judge, versus 2 to 4. It's important for especially the senior experts, for at least 2. I wouldn't recommend more than 4. You've seen us do 4 here. It can become long. So somewhere between 2 or 4. And I think the main part on that is that it should be diversity. When I say diversity is, for Tom and I will often do it in the sense of his reactions are different than mine, that can be quite powerful in setting the example for the audience, that there is diversity. There's no one right feedback. It's not, if you see Charlie and Megan, Charlie has a certain style, Megan has a certain style. Some people resonate with what, the Charlie's feedback. Some people resonate with Megan's. That diversity of thought is a positive thing, not a negative thing.
Yeah, I just want to add actually something to the point above it, the role modeling high standards, and how we have done this at early iterations when the judges weren't there, and it was just like crowd feedback, and it didn't work in a whole number of different levels. But when you have crowd feedback, it tends to be very polarized. Meaning you'll get up like a lot of 4s and a lot of 1s. You get like this very sort of, all over the place kind of feedback. And the problem is that to the receiver, that becomes paralyzing. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to do with it. They end up just ignoring it. And further, it doesn't, the beauty of this dynamic is that everyone in the crowd, because they're participating and pretending basically to be a judge, they're learning how to be a better coach and a better feedback giver. But if they don't have anyone to compare it to, like, that dynamic doesn't happen. So that's sort of the combination of why 2 and 3 are so important.
Mm-hmm. The fourth one is, and this is a challenge. This is a challenge, and I've fallen trap into this personally. It's a common pattern of the emphasis is teeing up people to succeed, particularly the presenters, versus, and I think Charlie touched on this, of thinking of it as practice and deliberately hard practice. And there's a few parts that hard on this. One, you'll feel bad. You'll feel bad of I want to put them in a pot that they look good among their peers. That's most common, very common pattern. But then there's a second one on this. One of the things you'll hear from people, and I've done this, and you heard this, through this, is that people need to understand, for instance, in 5 minutes, you have to set up a 5-minute role play. You have to set up whatever that part might be. You don't have to set it up to succeed. In fact, you can set up for a challenge. If you think about even Scott, there was a part where it was a business cycle that he was going through. He ended up getting a lot of feedback that had nothing to do with the business cycle, right? Or it was in lieu of it. And my point being is that sometimes under challenges, the more challenges come in, that it does increase the stress, and the value that you end up finding in kind of the teaching of it ends up being more powerful. When it's played safe and set up people to succeed, something that they're already good with, what's the value that they're already getting? So I've just seen that as a common pattern. The fifth one, which is important, I probably should put this up first, is these are the ones that are super gung-ho on this, and not skeptical enough that there are challenges in doing, even at the basic level 1.1, is leveling up too soon. And as opposed to graduate and ready. And I think I have a slide, we'll come back to this. Do we have just is it the next one with the? So this was I think we've certainly verbalized this. This is a more visual diagram of it. You know, level 1 is the technical skills 10x. And I know we've said this a few points again. That's the starting point. Start at the technical standpoint. We're recommending Air Force, I think, presentation skills, you know, with Fidelity, the kind of the sales, the technical skills. You saw that more modeled today. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Touched on them before, but reason number 1, in the beginning, especially some of the candidate feedback, it's more difficult for, you saw it in our leadership 10X, trying to give candidate feedback on someone's leadership, on the way that is tougher. Giving on their, you know, their mission part, their book of business is tougher. It's tougher to be candid. On sales skills, it's easier to imagine both as the receiver of it, but also the giver of it. They're about to go to a client. They're going to have that conversation. Might as well be better in that conversation now. It's easier to do it. So it lowers in the beginning part of building trust around the ritual, psychological safety with the team. It's very important of not leveling up too soon. So then there's a question of, okay, well, we're really good at now. We've done the technical. When are we ready? I've gotten that question several times. When are we ready to level it up? The way I think about this in terms of graduate is it's not a time. We do think in some ways, if it's very deliberate practice, you can probably do it in 3 to 6 months. But there is an element of what we call amateur to pro, and you can start to feel it. And what we mean by amateur is that, you know, the feedback's not candid, right? It's not being role modeled within a group. It's softball. It's all the practices that we kind of normally give. That's what we would call amateur feedback. Versus pro is a direct, kind of at the point. And it's not the judges. It's the team. It's the team. And I would argue that and advocate, we've seen that it does start with the senior role models. But it takes time for the team and the reason I say that is you start to notch up the difficulty of this. If the team is struggling on giving candidates, I'll just use Fidel as an example, candidness and giving sales on the business cycle, there's just no way they're going to be ready for the next level. So that's what we mean in terms of, it's just a question, when do we level up? So number 6, the not rotating presenters. We've done this less. We've been pretty good at rotating presenters, but I've seen fall in a pattern with teams where they want people to go back again. So they put the same people back on the hot seat and again and again. I'd encourage you to think about rotating it. And the rotating helps prevent what I call the haters, in the sense of over time, it actually goes reverse. You start people that are not candid, but over time, if they never believe they have to be on the hot seat, they'll get more candid. They're role modeling this, if that more directness. But there is an element that knowing that you're going to be in the hot seat, there's a time when, you know, that feedback you recognize also has to land and help. And when you're in on it, you'll see as a receiver the difference of feedback that is maybe very candid, but there to help versus one that's just what we call to hate. So that's one element there that we recommend just to rotate through. And the last one is, for lack of a better word, setting up system 2 rules versus allowing system 1 intuition. And I think sometimes, especially when there's a lot of rules that are put in place, there's a tendency to want to kind of put rules in place of here's the feedback you can give, here's how to give it, here's not how to give it, here's what to do and not to do. And all of a sudden, you're starting to train your group of turning off their system 1, their intuition. How is their reaction to it? What did they think? How did they react to that? What is their intuition? That is the point of I think, feedback in that experiential learning, is to train that system 1 versus if you put too much system 2. The challenge comes into that is you're going to have to allow that there is going to be some system 1 thinking that you might wish didn't come out, which gets into a little bit of the recovery process, which Charlie touched on. So those are the 7 ones I thought we'd start.